libertarianism is pro-immigration, pro-market, pro-trade.
More competitive, less centralized. Not military confrontations, but peaceful interaction.
The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster.
I'm actually a recent graduate of Stoneman Douglas High School, where the massacre recently happened a few months ago. And I would like to ask you, what do you propose could be a solution that all conservatives, liberals, and libertarians could agree with in preventing incidents of mass gun violence from occurring, and or the possible regulation of automatic weapons?
Well, if we're talking just about these school shootings, and we are now not talking about inner city drug-related, gang-related violence, for which I think the very best solution is to legalize drugs. But if we're focusing on schools, then the solutions are, in my view, better mental health data in the NICS database, and that means requiring states to provide data to the federal system. Now, right now, you can't force the states to provide the data, but you can do it by conditioning, by rewarding states for providing the data, or by penalizing them in some sense if they don't provide data. So there are all sorts of benefits that the federal government gives to the states, and those benefits can be withheld if the states don't cooperate. So that would be one thing, a better database on mental health. The second would be a ban on magazine size above 20 rounds. Again, some of these things I don't think would do a great deal of good, but I think we ought to try them, and I don't think it threatens the right of self-defense. The third is an assault weapons ban where assault weapons are properly defined. And by that, I don't mean that any semi-automatic weapon that has a bayonet mount or a pistol grip that has nothing whatsoever to do with its lethality should be defined as an assault weapon. It should be based on the bullet size, the bullet speed, and the fact that it's semi-automatic. If you could identify commonly used, guns that are not commonly used, that are especially dangerous, then those things I think could be banned. And then finally, I would have no objection to expanding background checks to covering private sales at gun shows. Right now, as I indicated, all sales at gun shows through dealers are subject to background checks. But the sales over the internet and private sales at gun shows, I think could be subject to background check. Again, particularly if the gun controllers would be willing to give to the gun rights folks some of the things that the gun rights folks have been seeking. And that would be interstate purchase of handguns, which is not presently allowed, transport across state lines as long as the weapon is legal in both states, and you can't do that right now, guarantees against a federal registry, which everybody in the gun community seems to be very concerned about. So those things would be very important, and reduction in the amount of time that it takes to conduct a background check. Now, interestingly, all of those proposals, including subjecting background checks, subjecting private purchases at gun shows to background checks, all of those were part of the Manchin-Toomey compromise bill that failed to get Senate support in 2013 and failed again in 2015. Manchin and Toomey are both willing to reintroduce that compromise bill if President Trump will sign on. So far, no word from President Trump. I think that compromise gives something to the gun rights community, it gives something to the gun controllers, and we ought to pass that legislation.
Hi, two questions for you. You talk about legalizing drugs being the best way to curb that violence. Just curious what drugs you would be referring to, if all of them or a select list. And the second question is regarding citizens to carry on a college campus. That I don't think I heard you discuss that. Are there any colleges right now where that happens, and what are the results, and why would you be for or against that?
Yeah, there are colleges that do allow people that are of age and that have concealed carry permits to carry guns on campus. As to what the results are, I haven't heard of any such colleges that have had any of these mass atrocities, but I don't mean to suggest that they haven't had the mass atrocities because they have people carrying guns. Maybe that's the reason, but I have no way of verifying that that's the reason. But there are some colleges that allow this. And of course, that's been a proposal by a number of gun rights advocates. Let people be armed who are otherwise qualified if they have a concealed carry permit which means they've gone through the requisite training for proficiency, for knowledge, and they have a permit, so if they can carry it anywhere else, why not carrying it on a campus? I find nothing objectionable to that. The other part of your question was? Oh, drugs. Which drugs would I legalize? Well, now I'm pretty hardcore on this, so I'm not suggesting that this is what would get through the legislature. I personally would legalize every single drug that didn't have, every single drug that did not produce violent side effects that would render innocent bystanders susceptible of injury. So if there were such a drug, let's say PCP, I don't know enough about the toxicology of these drugs to tell you, but if PCP made people violent and subjected folks around those people to the prospect of imminent and serious injury, I certainly would not legalize PCP. But on the other end, we have marijuana, you know, as far as I know, kills nobody, and that's illegal. And we've got tobacco that we're told kills 400,000 people a year, and then you can get tobacco legal everywhere. So this is really nuts as far as I'm concerned. So I think I would legalize anything that doesn't produce violent side effects.
Yes, there's a board to keep track.
Hi, so you said that in order for us to push more gun control legislation, you would have to have the gun control advocates produce evidence why their legislation would prevent this violence. How would you respond to the popular argument from their side that you look at all these other countries who have stricter gun control and they don't have as much violence as the United States? That's a popular belief on that side. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, the statistics are disputable. There's not very much correlation between the percentage of folks that have guns in a given country and the amount of gun violence. You got extremes on all ends. You take Israel, that has enormous gun possession and a very low crime rate. Same thing with Switzerland. So you have and you have other places that have banned guns, like Jamaica, and you have huge amount of violent crime. So I think the statistics are disputable, but even more important, even if the statistics were clear, there are cultural differences between these countries, and it's very difficult to hold those variables constant in comparing one country against another country. So I wouldn't put too much faith in this inter-country comparisons. By the way, let me mention one other thing, and that is on this drug issue, because I think it's an important one. We've had marijuana legalized, of course, as you know, for recreational purposes, at least in Colorado and Washington State, Oregon, and Alaska. So the results there is that there have been little or no rise in use, and possible declines, interestingly, in cocaine and heroin use. That is, if people can get legal marijuana, why expose themselves to criminal prosecution by going after a different drug? The evidence on traffic accidents is inconclusive. But bear in mind, even if you could show that by legalizing marijuana, you got more people that are endangering other folks in the traffic accidents, that's not a reason to ban marijuana. You know, we have more people getting drunk and hurting other people in cars, but what we do is not ban alcohol, we ban driving under the influence. So we should do the same thing with marijuana. We don't need to ban marijuana, we ban driving under the influence of marijuana, which is what creates the potential harmful effect. And the opioid crisis is kind of interesting. This crisis is not so much because doctors who are goaded by greedy drug companies are overprescribing. Less than a quarter of the people that are using opioids for non-medical reasons have a prescription. And the rest of them are getting their opioids on the black market. And the prescriptions of these high-dose opioids are down 41% in the last 8 years. Overdoses continue to climb, but those overdoses are mostly from heroin and fentanyl. And interestingly, if you pressure doctors to reduce these opioid prescriptions, they can have the unintended consequence of forcing patients to the black market where they get laced opioids and get heroin that's a lot cheaper and a lot easier to obtain. So, and we also have less serious opioid problems in the states that have legalized marijuana. That's kind of an interesting dynamic. Now, this is more on the drug issue, but I do think this legalization of drugs, if you don't want to go all the way to legalizing everything, at least marijuana, would go a long way to reducing some of the gun violence in the major cities.
Hi. I was just wondering, you brought up mental health background checks and how those should be improved. But how would that work in such a way that it would still protect the medical records and potential employment and even acceptance to grad schools that people with mental health issues may face? And when you talk about improving, are you talking about violent mental illness or even including people with stuff like bipolar disorder or depression?
Well, again, I'm certainly no expert. I'm not even an educated layperson on the issue of mental health. So, first of all, which mental diseases? Well, obviously, those mental diseases that might lead one to use a firearm in a manner that visits injury and harm on other innocent folks. Which mental illnesses are they? I have not the least idea. I just don't know enough about it. So I do think we need to improve the mental health system. I do think we need to be conscious of privacy and protect civil liberties. I don't know what the proper bright line is between civil liberties on the one hand and making sure that crazy people don't get guns on the other. But there are people who are expert in these areas, and they ought to come together and decide what these lines ought to be. Not people like me who don't know much about it, but there are experts who can reach some reasonable conclusion on this area.
On the issue of drugs, would you comment on how the laws against drugs create profit and create the big business of drug trade?
Well, if you make something illegal, of course, it means very few people are involved in producing it. Who is involved are people that are running the risk of illegality. So they are incurring a very, very big cost. That is the potential for being locked up. And as a result of that very, very big cost, number one, they don't have much competition because everybody who would like to produce drugs doesn't want to take a chance of breaking the law. And number two, they have to recover this big cost, and they do so by increasing the price of drugs. So what we have is price of drugs going up, 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 and companies that are producing drugs, not companies, but gangs or countries, they are making a fortune on the production of drugs. And the way to fix that, of course, is to increase the supply. That's Econ 101. If you want to lower the price, you increase the supply. How do you increase the supply? Let Pfizer go make drugs, or one of the other major pharmaceutical companies make drugs. Let those folks who can effectively and efficiently and at low cost manufacture drugs, let them do so. And the price will be driven down. The profit margin will be squeezed out of the sale of drugs. The people that are in gangs will no longer have the profit motive to produce those drugs, and will have less violence because the disputes with companies like Pfizer or some other legal manufacturer of drugs, those disputes can be resolved by contract. And if not by contract, by tort law in the courts, not on the streets with guns. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I heard that doctors can get cocaine for the price of aspirin.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the recent article by retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens recommending the repeal of the Second Amendment? I think you had something to say about that in the New York Times, I believe.
Yes, I did. This article was horribly irresponsible to suggest repeal of the Second Amendment, and let me tell you why it's irresponsible. See, the NRA has, for many, many years, cited this quote from a guy named Pete Shields. Pete Shields was the co-founder of the Brady Center for the Prevention of Gun Violence. And here's the quote. The first problem is to slow down the number of handguns being sold. The second problem is to get handguns registered. The final problem is to make possession totally illegal. So what's the NRA say about that quote? They say, look, there's the proof that the liberals, the left,